And we are live.
Yay. Okay. Welcome everybody to ABT time, the ABT podcast. And with today's two special guests, the first of whom is with us right now, Dr. Maria Byrne, coming to us live in the morning in Sydney from Sydney University. And you got your cup of coffee, right?
Yeah, I do.
Cheers. Oh, wait, hold that up. You go in and out of the background. There you are.
All right.
When you go in and out of the frame of view, suddenly it all vanishes. What do you got behind you? Is that Heron Island or what?
That's One Tree Island. It's where I was the director for 12 years. The University of Sydney has a research station on just one tip of it.
Nice. And that's right near Heron, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Just 10 kilometers from Heron.
Yeah, I spent a couple weeks at Heron. I never did get over to One Tree. Very cool. So welcome everybody. We got a million things to talk about. We're going to spend a half an hour first off talking about starfish larvae, but actually to set this up, to get started right before we even get into your background, anything else like that, everything has got to have an ABT relevance, context to narrative and that sort of stuff. And all of this stuff is going to very much. So we're going to dive into work that I did 30 years ago and work that Maria is doing right now with the starfish larvae. But at the core of it all is the overall situation, which is once upon a time, our good buddy Chuck Birkeland told a great story about the crown of thorns starfish, about what causes the population explosions, the outbreaks. And that story took off like wildfire in the early 80s. And it was an excellent story. Then I set to work testing one part of it, and the rest is kind of history. But it really runs into a textbook case of what we've talked a lot about in the courses that I teach on narrative, which is narrative is so powerful that when you tell a good story that makes really good common sense, it's pretty hard sometimes for the science to go up against it. You got any thoughts on that as a starting point, Maria?
Well, I do. The real trouble is people get so caught up in their own ideas without thoroughly testing them first, and they become paradigmatic before we have the data to support the paradigm.
Yeah.
And, and the interesting thing is most good ideas have a scarrick of truth, have a scarrick of relevance, but they cannot be taken holus bolus without a proper testing the alternatives. And this is the trouble that's happened with science over and over again. A good idea is so, and sometimes in the context of Australia, it became very convenient because the Australian authorities were under big pressure to actually explain this menace, this Thorns outbreak.
Well, we'll get into that. Let's start with holus bolus. That's our starting point. I need to use that term more, holus bolus. Actually, one of the first things I want to say is Chuck Birkeland, who really kind of gave birth to the big story, is a wonderful guy. And he was my professor when I was an undergraduate. I learned invertebrate natural history from the guy, one of my all-time favorite marine biologists. And just last January, we ran our Story Circles narrative training with NOAA in Hawaii. We had a demo day, and Chuck came and took part. It was there the whole day. And he's always been such a good sport in that whole thing because, there was the potential for me to be obnoxious. And there I was testing his ideas, and he could have been territorial, who knows what. And from the very outset, all he ever said was, I'm really eager to hear what you're doing and what you're finding out to see if my ideas really do hold up. So he's been sort of a role model in terms of the sort of open-minded scientist that puts the ideas out there without an ego attached to him and doesn't sit there. I mean, we know plenty of other examples of people that don't do that, but he's been a great sport in terms of that. And so, let's just start here. And again, we'll eventually get into a bit of your biographical details, things of that sort, but wanting everybody to be right there with us in terms of what we're talking about. So we're going to start with me sharing just a few slides for a minute or two. Here's a little intro biology lecture on what this starfish thing is all about. And here are just 4 slides. So super simple. The crown of thorns starfish. Oops, let me scoot that over so it looks better. Oops, make it bigger. The crown of thorns starfish is this horrible beast that lives on coral reefs throughout the Pacific. You don't find it in the Caribbean, but it's common, especially in the Western Pacific. And from the early 60s, there were reports of enormous outbreaks of coves and bays that would have a million or several million starfish all in one reef. And the problem is that this starfish is large and thorny with many 15 or 20 arms, and it feeds on live coral. So it climbs up on top of the corals and everts its stomach and devours their tissue and kills the corals. And so it can destroy entire coral reefs. And over the years, it's been kind of, the picture's been painted of it, this monster out of control. It is a plague species, and it's damaged a lot of coral reefs over the years. At this point, I mean, the craziest thing to be said about the starfish problem is a solid 60 years of research on it. And in some ways, we're still kind of at square one. Wouldn't you agree, Maria?
I would. We've got some inferences, but I think what people were just not thinking out of the box a bit, and it was an intractable problem. And maybe, I mean, a lot of people that did the work maybe weren't so. And to, you know, like if John Pierce was here, our dear friend, they would say, look across the larvae, look across the asteroidea. Are there any clues? And I think I often say the missing pieces in the jigsaw puzzle were just not addressed. And I think that was those were the devil. The devil was in the detail, and some of those details were missed, Randy. I mean, you started looking at some of those details when you had the larvae in the lagoon. But I do believe, I think there were some opportunities missed, I have to say.
Yeah, I do think that if there were enough money thrown at it with enough sustained, really hardcore, well-organized, enormous numbers of scientists, the question might eventually be answered, but that never happens in the oceans. And that's the problem around a lot of topics. One of the things I'm involved with nowadays is narrative. And people are all excited about, you know, neuroscience is telling us how the brain processes stories and things like that. Well, one of the lead guys is Yuri Hassan, neurophysiologist at Princeton University. And I visited with him a few years ago, and I was asking him the simplest of questions. You know, when you put people in the MRI and you have them watch films that are this and that, what do you see for brain activity? And he just chuckled and he said, you don't understand how expensive it is to do MRI research, that it's $10,000 per session. And if you're studying neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's or something, yeah, you can get tons of millions of dollars to study it. But if you want to study how the brain processes narrative, nobody feels that's an important question. And as a result, you can't get the money to actually do the research that you want to do. So there's some similarities with ocean science, which is that it's all difficult. It's all under the water. And that's why you get 60 years of people working on this problem. And still, they can't even tell you why it's just crazy in some ways. These outbreaks still happen, and they move up and down the Great Barrier Reef, and they happen in isolated islands in the middle of nowhere. And I think Berkland in some way did the very best ideation, I would say, on the whole problem. You know, the idea that he put together this testable model and idea in the early 80s. And his idea was that in normal conditions, the larvae of these starfish starve to death, and your average conditions, you know, every year they produce millions of larvae, almost all of them starve to death, only a few survive. But every once in a while, you get a year where there's been a phytoplankton bloom, what they feed on. And when those years happen, then all the larvae survive. And then 2 to 3 years later, they all show up and cause this giant outbreak. And this is what the outbreaks look like. You get just arm to arm starfish marching across the reef. In many places, there have been island atolls and things where the outbreaks happen on one side, the population split in half, and they marched all the way around the circular island, met on the other side, eating all the rest of the corals, and then they all just die of starvation after they've eaten themselves out of house and home. This is what the life cycle of the starfish looks like. This is derived from the diagram that I helped to create back at Ames and back in 30 some years ago. And the starfish reproduce, they produce eggs and sperm in mass spawning events. They get together and they fertilize large numbers, and then they turn into larvae that live for probably 10 to 15 days or so, I think, drifting around the water. And they grow during that time, and then eventually they sink down back to the reef and then attach themselves and turn into baby starfish. And then 2 to 3 years later, show up in these big outbreaks. Here's a picture of the actual larvae and the baby starfish there in the top left corner. And so that's the stuff that I worked on. This is what Maria now works on. And so that is my intro for everybody so that they're up to speed with what we're talking about. And if people are just listening to the audio version, you could just picture what a starfish looks like. And sorry about that, but let me stop sharing then. And from now we will just chit chat. So you take it from there, Maria. Tell me what sort of things you're up to these days with the larvae.
Well, there's a couple of things. Is that the one thing that Chuck Birkeland did have in one of his papers? He said the Faustian traits of the crown of thorns. That was and he was right. Every animal is the success of any animal depends on all the parts that contribute to that success. And reproduction and larvae are just one aspect of the success. So there's a couple of things that the crown of thorns starfish have going for it. We found that it's possible that they might be self-fertilizing. So they might even be able to, in a pinch, when a female is spawning 200 million eggs, doesn't take much for those to be successful. So huge fecundity. The eggs themselves are really big. One wonders, you've got all the starfish in the sea. Why this one? Why has this one been so successful at the larval stage? And its neighbor, the cobalt blue Lynchia, hasn't done as well. And there's the other thing is that the maternal provisioning, and I've been doing that for years. Mom puts a lot of goodies in those eggs. It's the size of an egg of a species that doesn't need to feed. So the larvae, as you said, you can't kill them. They do not starve. They can go on for months and not die because, first of all, they start off life with a lot of goodies. And in that goodies is a little bit of chemical protection. So some fish won't eat them as well. So they've got extra fat to keep them going and extra toxins so they're not fed. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing which we've discovered, which was completely, I had a hunch. So we did the microbiome, and sure enough, in the gut, in the stomach of the larva are these phototrophic bacteria. So you look at all reefs, and reefs have got symbiosis, and in tropical systems, some symbiosis rules. So here we have potentially, now we haven't proven it yet, another example of Darwin's paradox, that their symbionts might be providing the food, which means they don't need a phytoplankton bloom. They're quite independent. So Randy, when you were doing your experiments way back when in lagoon water, as long as those bacteria are in the sun and get the wavelength, they might be providing the larvae with nutrients.
Oh, wow.
The other thing that we found...
That's all pretty new.
Oh, yeah, that's new. That's totally new. What needs to be done now is we need to do radio label, talk about extra money for the kind of research that you really need to do.
Yeah.
What we really need to do is we need to do some radio labeled carbon tracing to see if indeed those photobacteria do provide the larva with nutrients. But of course, that's hard work. It's not my specialty and it costs money. And I'd have to hire somebody and pay for the radioactive tracing to get that done. So that's somebody it's just like, it's an idea that needs to be followed up. The other thing that we found, let me ask you a few questions. Where are you working on these starfish? Do you work at One Tree or do you go up to the north? Yeah, I work at One Tree, and what I want to do is I want to repeat your experiment at One Tree Lagoon where I raise the larvae in the lagoon. So One Tree has got it's interesting because it has a stable, low density population of cots that has never outbroken. And for everybody's benefit, COTS is crown of thorns starfish, COTS, right? COTS. So we can just GPS the males and the females. We just take a little bit of gonad out of their armpit, take them back to the lab and spawn them. We don't even have to collect the adults. So it's really a convenient place to work. In fact, we can walk to our animals. They're in a really shallow part of the lagoon. So it's really convenient. So I do it at One Tree and I do it up at Lizard. We've done it, but we've been supported by the Lizard Island Foundation. So a lot of our work from about 2015 to about till COVID was done up at Lizard Island as well. So that was really important because we got a little bit of seed money so that we could actually at least pay the bench fees to get and flights to get up there. But anyway, how's that? Yeah. Wait, hang on. How's that lab doing nowadays, Lizard Island? Oh, quite good. Anne and Lyle are still there. Is that right? Yeah. They just work so hard. They've done so well. Yeah. In fact, Anne has just sent me some plankton samples, and we're going to see if we can find the larvae in the lagoon, which would be very nice to see because The other thing that we've noticed is we've discovered is that COTS larvae clone.
Oh, remember Sid Bosch was working on that a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
And Sid and John Pierce had a paper
Yeah.
on that. Yeah, that they drift around out there in the open ocean for a long time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so Sid is actually involved in the plankton samples as well, and we're going to try and figure out if they clone naturally. But some pictures of crown of thorns larvae in papers are illustrate cloning, but they didn't know what they were looking at. It's bizarre.
Oh, wow.
So I've got demonstrated plankton samples, pictures of crown of thorns larvae with larvae in the middle of cloning. So it happens.
So let me ask you some bigger, broader questions. How prevalent is the problem of the starfish these days? I haven't been in tune for 10 or 15 years of what's happening down there. Are lots of island systems having problems with these starfish eating up their reef, or is it, what about in the Great Barrier Reef?
So I can't really speak for there's some work in the middle of the Indian Ocean. There's been some outbreaks, but I don't know what the latest is in other areas outside of Australia. But the Great Barrier Reef is in the middle of another outbreak as well. Okay,
so then tell me a little bit how that outbreak's going. Is it marching as a wave coming from the north going south, or what?
Well, there is a general movement from north to south, but there's a massive outbreak in the middle in the southern barrier reef, which in no way can be connected to the north. That's a different scenario. And so I'm sure that the initiation box and the marching scenario maybe works for the north, but I don't know if it works for the entire Great Barrier Reef. So that story also needs to be addressed as well. That was another pet idea. But they could never demonstrate it genetically. Maybe with some of the new markers, and some people are doing that now, they can actually see that the two populations are separate. But the other interesting example is that if the larvae do clone, then you're looking at a bunch of relatives. They're all going to be asexually reproduction, and that's going to really influence the population genetic signal. Oh, wow. In fact, Mike Hart and I have modeled some of the notion that what would happen to the population genetic signal if those larvae were out there splitting and budding and make more of themselves. So I think that might interfere with any understanding of where larvae come from, where larvae go, and where the source of the outbreaks are.
Is the government still believing that the cane fields, the runoff from the cane fields affects the starfish?
Well, that's kind of been muted a bit, because there's absolutely no proof that in 30 years there's been, you mentioned that they ran into a plankton bloom and 3 years later they become a juvenile and appear. There's not a single example of a connection between a runoff event and a phytoplankton bloom and a COTS outbreak. Not one single outbreak has been tied to a runoff event.
And yet there's been a ton of money spent to try and make that connection.
Well, it became a little bit conflated, because at the end of the day, it was very good to reduce the pollution that's going out into the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon. Corals don't like to have sediment and toxins thrown on them. So regardless, water quality is a good thing to get a handle on, but don't necessarily use that as the major management action to prevent crown of thorns outbreaks, because that's not necessarily, the connection's not there.
How is that? Tell me a few things about how the reef is doing in general. When you go up to Lizard, do you do many dives around there? You go out to the ribbon reefs and see how they're doing?
Well, I don't get out to the ribbon reefs, but I have been diving around Lizard, and I tell you, it's so sad. The 2016, we've had 3 bleaching events in 5 years, and the reefs are in the north. The reefs are really, really suffering, and some of them they're coming back slowly. But the biggest threat to coral reefs is hot water, and we can't manage hot water. The only thing I was just up in a meeting in Cairns. The only action that's available to the Australian government to help reduce or provide some sort of breathing space for the Great Barrier Reef is to kill COTS, and that's what they've spent $61 million
What?
Yeah, $61 million in the COTS killing campaign.
Wow. Where has that been focused?
Mostly up at the north. But what's interesting is like some reefs, they've had the 30 visits because they kill them all with lethal injection. And then the cots die, and then they come back next week and the cots are back again. And some reefs stay. And that's because I believe we've got the juveniles. I think the disconnect between the larvae and the adults is that the juveniles are accumulating in the reef infrastructure.
Wow. And what do they kill them with? With copper sulfate or?
No, they used to do that, but that's not allowed now because that's a toxin.
Right.
Vinegar.
Well, really?
Vinegar, the injection of vinegar.
Huh. Like, do you have to inject a lot in them?
I think they have to inject, I don't know how much it is, but a mill in a couple of places, they've got these special guns, injection guns that the drivers did. Bang, 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 you know, it's pretty intense.
That is crazy. And $61 million?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And they're just throwing it into the wind.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, if they want to, they are getting some protection, but it means that they have to go back and back and back and back to protect reefs. And so, yes, they're knocking the COTS issue, but then the thing is, if it turns out that indeed the reef infrastructure is housing an army of juvenile COTS, and they may stay as juveniles, the actual culling program may release the juveniles from the competition from the adults, and then they just come out as another wave.
Wow. So for everybody listening, one of the things we did in preparation for this was I managed to track down this article in the New Yorker from, when was it? I think July of 1988.
Yeah.
It was really at the end of my time there in Australia working on the starfish problem. And then I sent that to Maria, and you got a chance to read the whole article. What'd you find entertaining in there?
What I found what's fascinating is 1988 is when I first arrived in Australia, right? And it had been really hot and COTS, and I thought I might work on Crown of Thorns, but it was such a political football.
Yeah.
You had Bob Endine at University of Queensland saying it was pretty much overfishing. Now, the voters along the coast of Queensland don't like to be told that their overfishing has caused an outbreak of COTS. Right. And so that was poo-pooed. And so that's why the mantra of having the terrestrial runoff and pollution into the reef as another alternative, a really nice way to hang their hat on to save the reef. So this controversy between what causes COTS went on for years. They gave a lot of money to the Australian Institute of Marine Science, AIMS, right. in Townsville, because essentially the people were saying, okay, fix the problem, guys, get rid of the starfish. And so it was a real scramble. But also because the money that was going to be thrown to COTS was now a real competition. The chance to get millions of dollars for boat time to get this going. Of course, AIMS, being the government agency, was very happy to fill its coffers.
Is AIMS still the main place people working on COTS there?
Yeah, but the James Cook Uni is there's a lot of people at James Cook Uni as well. And of course, you see, I used to say that I'm from New South Wales, south of the border, and us south of the border types, we were not really welcome up north because we didn't want to upset the gravy train of these people, even if we might have known something about starfish, you know.
Right.
But anyway, so I stayed away from it. But what's very interesting, sitting on the side, knowing what I'd known about going to Australia after what I knew about sea star larvae, working with Sid, working with John, your work, and I knew your work, and Donald Manhan, and all those controversies that I had in my head because I'd read all the literature and had worked on the system. Coming to Australia, I thought, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. Why aren't they asking this question? Why are they not asking that question? So I said, oh, whatever, let them off. But they weren't going to solve the problem, not with the approach that they came. Yeah. But Bob Endine was probably quite correct. I actually think overfishing is a really, really important part of the conundrum. See,
wow. Yeah, but you know, this the problem is this is such a large scale problem because
Yeah.
not just the Great Barrier Reef, then you take those ideas and you go out to these isolated islands in the middle of the Pacific.
Yeah.
And do the ideas hold up? That's what was so great about Birkeland's idea, was that he synthesized on such a large scale.
Yeah.
But then when you looked more closely at what he had synthesized, it started to fall apart at that level. And the crazy thing is, all these years later, like what was it, the Warehouse or was it Westinghouse expeditions they had in the 60s with Rick Cheshire, and they went out there and studied those things. So that's getting to be almost 60 years of research on this thing. And it's still just, I think it's a picture of how little we know when it comes to the oceans for some of these fundamental things that, you know, we know a lot about physical predictions and currents and things like that, but the biology is just unbelievably, for even a shallow water species like this, is so.
Well, I think what's really interesting is that the crown of thorns larvae is highly evolved. It's highly specialized. And I actually think if it runs into a patch of phytoplankton, it will use it. Of course it will. And it'll do well. But if that and so it could be that, you know, what Charles's idea that extra food makes the larvae more successful. Well, that's the kind of scenario with almost any larva.
Yeah.
But if you get thousands of larvae hitting a phytoplankton bloom, they'll do better. But then that phytoplankton bloom also has low salinity water, and larvae don't like low salinity. So it's a little bit complex.
How many other people are working on the larvae now?
Well, there's a whole new set of money, believe it or not, Randy.
Oh, maybe I'll retire from the podcasting business and come back and return to my studies on the starfish larvae.
There's a whole new, it's CCIP, the Crown of Thorns initiation. It's being run, Crown of Thorns control program. There's a whole new wave of money that's been put at this, and so people have been putting in grants, including myself. And so there's going to be, but it's not just for the larvae; it's for the adults, for better ways to kill them, to see if you can find diseases. I mean, it's the whole gamut of.
Has anybody made any documentaries on it in recent years?
No, and that would really be an interesting story, because
it's a massive story.
The government gave $455 million to a tiny organization called the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, which has been pretty much a research broker. And this Great Barrier GBRF has actually been charged with disseminating these funds. So it's an odd way to fund all this research on the Great Barrier Reef, but that's the current situation in Australia.
That's crazy. And we're just about out of time here, but I'll have you come back again, because this, of course, is my ongoing long-term interest. And it's fascinating. It just keeps on going. I mean, will it ever be solved?
It might not be solved, but in the process of it won't be solved, because this animal is so specialized. It's sitting in its right place. But I think the interesting thing, we'll learn a lot about sea star evolution by drilling down to the pieces, as Charles Birkeland would said, the Faustian traits. What is it about this sea star that makes it tick? And that's what's fascinating.
That's amazing. Cool. Okie doke. Well, that's some of the basics for today. And thank you very much for joining me for a cup of tea.
Pleasure.
And I will check back in with you. And thanks. And have a good day down under.
Take care, and take care all. Bye-bye. Bye, Randy.
Okay, thanks. And so that is our first guest for today. That just blew by. And there's so much more to be talked about there. It's a big, big story. And now I've got a second guest lined up for today. And Amogh, if you want to join us here. And Amogh Thakkar, there he is. Hey there. So Amogh is my ABT best buddy. We met about 3 months ago. He wrote to me back in February, said he had read a little bit about the ABT and it had kind of stirred his interests. And we have gone to work ever since then with a little conversation. Let's start off with some details, Amogh. You are 17 years old. You're a senior in high school in Maryland. And tell me a few things about what are you up to these days?
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Amogh. I'm 17 in Maryland, as Dr. Olson just said. And I'm a filmmaker. Yeah. I guess I'll phrase this in the ABT structure. So I'm a filmmaker and I'm in Maryland, but I also have a very strong interest in science and basically every part of it, especially biology and space science. I mean, really, who isn't interested in those two things? But I've taken an extreme liking to those in school and out of school, just researching. Had the best teachers by far in the sciences.
All right, that's excellent. Let me start with some questions. I want to interview you here on a few of these dynamics about your world, because most of the people working with us right now in the ABT training a little bit older than you. And as a matter of fact, one of the patterns that we've kind of seen is that younger people have a harder time kind of connecting with the ABT. So you're definitely an outlier in that regard. We'll get into that in some depth. Let me start with the simplest and silliest of questions. Next door to me is a family. They've got a kid who's like in his early 20s. He plays one of these online games, like maybe Call of Duty or something like that. And all day long, he's sitting in his room and I can hear him shouting, over his headset, I'm going in, I'm going to get my back, dude, get my back. I'm getting the Phoenix and all this stuff. I haven't even asked him what game it is. He's a really nice guy. But if you got a bunch of friends like that just live their whole lives online, playing those online games.
Oh yeah, and I'm a kid as well. I play games. It's not like I just don't play games. But no, I definitely have a lot of friends who have spent the majority of their life on Call of Duty or playing Minecraft or something. Which I mean, I guess it suits them, and I'm sure they have. They're going to do very well in life. Knowing them, I think my friend group is. I know them pretty well, and they're really awesome.
Hang on. Tell me more about what does their lifestyle consist of? They spend like day and night and on hours and hours on, and are those the two main games, Minecraft and Call of Duty, or what else?
I am not entirely sure. I feel like I know they don't get, I don't know that much about their lifestyles. I mean, I know them obviously, but they do play a lot of games and something, I guess their life would going to school and then coming back either, getting on some sort of game, maybe Call of Duty. I don't know what the two main games are. I think Call of Duty is a big one. But I guess as a senior, it's not as prevalent as it was maybe in middle school or early high school.
Oh, is that right? Is there kind of a peak time when guys mostly get into it and then they start to lose some interest?
Yeah, I think so. It's probably around like early high school, middle school. Obviously, there's outliers on both ends, but yeah. I mean, I think my friends are more into sports and athletics rather than like gaming. I know I do have friends who are into that as well, and a lot of times they might play like League of Legends or something like that. But yeah, I guess it depends on who the person is.
Are you doing any sports?
I do. I play soccer. I played soccer actually earlier than I got into filmmaking, earlier than I got into anything. That was my first big love. And I played for a while. I got into a pretty decent league, and then I got into like middle or high school, and I was like, I like filmmaking more than soccer. I'm sorry. So I focus my life on.
Have you
Randy, we have a quick comment from chat.
Sure.
We'd like Amogh to stop calling you Dr. Olson because we're worried you'll make the rest of us call you Dr. Olson as well.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry.
There we go. All right, let's pull that back. No more doctors for Randy. Perfect. Thank you very much for that fine scale adjustment. You made any films on soccer?
I have actually, yes. When I was in middle school, we were making I was making my first films, and a lot of them featured heavily soccer themed things. So I don't think I made one specifically, the entire subject on soccer, but it's been featured in many of my films.
Yeah. So your interest in science, are you like interested in mostly lab science, molecular biology, or nature? Do you get out into nature? Do you make any films out in the forest or anything like that?
I love them both. I've done some work with National Geographic, so I'm pretty familiar with kind of the nature end. Like not super familiar. I'm not like expert or anything, not even close. But I think what interests me the most, as I said before, was probably molecular biology, just how our cells and how all of that works. It just seems so incredibly perfect. It's kind of scary. So I love just learning about that stuff and really, knowing how the world works, physics. And but I think what most interests me is space science and astrophysics and just how all those things work. It's just like really crazy. And it's probably what I'm going to make a lot of films on in the future.
Yeah. What do you see for science related films in general? Do lots of them interest you? Do you have any complaints about them? What do you see when you watch science films?
Oh yeah. So I think a lot of science films are documentaries. I'm not the biggest fan of documentaries actually. Even though I've taken a part in a few, I don't resonate with them as much as fictional narrative films. I think for me, the best science films are the ones that infuse science inside a fictional narrative, something like The Martian or Interstellar. Although they weren't heavily dependent on science, I think it's so much more fascinating when there's like a fictional world where like they're explaining an entirely different world to you, like a sci-fi film, but that world is like accurate science. You know, it's like instead of explaining some foreign world, we're explaining our world, but it just is so cool. You know, our world is already so cool. Why can't we just explain that? So I think those are the best films for me. Fictional narrative films.
Okay, all right. So tell me the story of the biggest disaster you've had so far making a film.
In film, oh boy. Okay. Well, one time I was filming something, and the actor who I was using, I kind of liked her a little bit. So I was very nervous when directing in general. I think this was like early on. It wasn't like near here, probably around like early high school. But I kind of just like did not provide any direction. I was just like kind of all over the place, awkward early high school teenager. And I basically just ended up just not making the film at all because I looked at the footage and I was like, no way, we are not doing this. It was just like too, cringy for me to even see. And yeah, so that was probably my biggest disaster.
Have you taken any acting classes?
I have, yeah. I've taken acting classes at the New York Film Academy. I really enjoyed it. It was with some really awesome teachers. I definitely prefer to be behind the camera, though. I do not like being in front of the camera as much.
Interesting. And
Randy, we got a question from chat here from Julie Clausen. Amogh, I love that you identify yourself as a filmmaker at your age. What sparked that drive to make films?
Yeah, sure. So I think it started off just trying to be a little bit different. My first film was made in middle school, as I said, or like first real film. We had a class assignment, and we had the choice between doing a performance and a video, and everybody else in the class was doing a performance. I was like, I'm just gonna do a video, why not be different? And once I kind of got into like the scripting process and all that, it was just kind of this like other world of communication. I don't think I was the best communicator, like speech wise or writing wise. So I was a very visual thinker. So when it came to filmmaking, it was like an immediate match. And I don't think storytelling was like a huge part, or at least a conscious part of my filmmaking, where I think I did a lot of storytelling subconsciously, but I didn't really pay attention to how powerful that is until a little bit later. And that's when I kind of fell in love with it again. I was like, wow, I can really drive some serious change with this.
Well, I mean, that's kind of everybody's progression, is that you start off with the easy stuff, which is content, and you get interested in content, and then you get drawn in by visuals, of course, and you start to try and make interesting visuals. And then it's a slow progression. You begin to realize, wait a second, there's something else going on here. As a matter of fact, just today in the ABT framework course, we talked about Nancy Duarte, who is kind of one of the superstars for business communications in Silicon Valley. And she's got 3 really popular books on communication. And she kind of went through a progression. She started in the early 2000s. She and her husband opened a business working with all these Silicon Valley companies where they would help them give better PowerPoint presentations. And her first book was called Slideology. And that whole book was about how to make really good slides and use all these visuals and all that kind of stuff. And then, as she told me, the more she worked with the slides and the presentation, she began to realize the same thing you're saying there, which is, wait, there's something more to this than just the visuals. If you're not telling a story at some point, it's really not going to resonate with people. And in fact, that was her second book, which is kind of her most popular one, around 2010, called Resonate. And that one was kind of a hybrid between visuals and storytelling. And then her third book, I think, called Illuminate, is more about storytelling. So she kind of ended up following that same journey of early on thinking it's just about having these amazing visuals, and then you slowly begin to see the story stuff and the narrative. Tell me a little bit about how you came across the ABT, and that's how you got in touch with me. So how'd that happen?
Yeah. So I read your book, Houston, We Have a Narrative. And I think it was more of like an interest thing where I just saw it, and I was well, I was gonna create a film on, I was like merging into this entire new world of science filmmaking, and that was like the thing that I really wanted to do. And I was just searching out like who are the biggest guys in this field, and where can I learn about all this stuff. And your name popped up, and then your book popped up, and I was like, okay, let me have a read, and I really loved it. I think I then started researching a lot more into kind of like what the ABT framework was, and then I got in contact with you, and that's kind of where it progressed.
Yeah, yeah. And where are you headed to now?
Like college-wise or like life?
Like, yeah, well, both. They're kind of intertwined.
Yeah, I guess.
Right.
So college-wise, I'm still making a decision. I was lucky enough to get two very solid offers, from one with a great scholarship at Johns Hopkins University and another solid scholarship to NYU, which is really annoying because Johns Hopkins is a very science-based university, while NYU is creativity and film-based. I'm leaning towards NYU just because I think if I was a college, I would be NYU. So I think I'd fit best in there, and I also love New York City, so that's probably where I'm headed.
If anybody listening has advice for him between those two, type it into the chat window. Matt, if you see anything interesting, let us know. People recommending one or the other, because I think he's still wrestling with this decision. Do you feel like you'll be studying film at NYU?
I think I'll be studying both science and film. So I'm considering actually majoring in film as well as a sort of engineering, something where I can not only create films on science, I can also create films with science. So using new technology, kind of pushing the limits of communication and creativity with new applied science, I guess. So kind of like that. And then also maybe minoring in biology or astronomy or something like that. I still haven't completely decided. Depends on which college I go to.
Yeah, yeah. And what's the film program like if you go there to NYU?
Oh, I mean, it's NYU, right?
Yeah. No, I know it's good, but like, what does their curriculum look like? You go right into production courses your freshman year, or do you wait a year or two, or what do they do?
I don't necessarily entirely know. I do know that it's a very hands-on environment, so they have a lot of resources and also a lot of really great alumni to come in and talk. So I think it's like a mix between the both. I think it also depends on what major I'm going to do. There's like different majors inside the filmmaking realm in NYU.
Oh, like what? Like production and writing?
Yeah, so there's the film and television major. I think that one's a lot more hands-on, and you're kind of actually making a lot of things. I obviously don't know too much. Like I'm not, as someone from NYU, if there's someone from NYU actually watching, they probably know a lot more than me right now. There's also a cinema studies major, which is probably a lot more theory and kind of how, like, kind of studying exactly how these films work, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Randy got another question from chat from Liz Foote, asking, funnily enough, if he has had a moment with the ABT, as in like a moment when everything clicked for you.
Yeah, exactly. Have you used it so far?
Yeah, definitely. So right a few days ago, actually, I think that was like my big moment. I'm making a film right now, and it is a narrative fictional film on quantum computing, kind of like how I was talking about before, but probably a little bit more focused on the science side. And when I talked with Randy, he said the next time you email me, you have to send an ABT. Like the first thing has to be an ABT. So I was going to email him again, and I knew I had to make an ABT. So I just used the film that I'm working on right now. And we were kind of like mixed on the story. It was like the story that was very complicated and kind of this mess of different backgrounds and just different like goals and things. So I really sat down for like 30 minutes or so, and we're just like, okay, what is the core thing to this? And I used the ABT, and the ABT forced me to get that core goal and the core, like problems that the characters are dealing with. And I think like I just sat down and that ABT thing just worked so well to really identify that. That was probably my clicking moment for the ABT.
Where are you at with that project? Have you started filming it, or you're still writing it?
No, we're still writing. So we are it's obviously a very hard project to write, because we're basically trying to teach quantum computing through the narrative, at least some parts of quantum computing. Also quantum physics. So like superposition and entanglement, those are the two major parts we're trying to teach. And it's kind of like the characters are actually going to learn that as well. So we're trying to find ways to like cleverly input kind of explainers inside the narrative where it fits best. So it's hard to write. So we're kind of experimenting a bunch of different ways to do it. But we're coming close to the ending, and looking to film probably in May-ish or so. We had like our crew lined up. I got that done early, which was great, honestly. Yeah.
What was that movie a few years ago? Was it The Big Short? Is that what it was? That was about
The Big Short. Yeah.
Yeah, and they had a bunch of explainer moments in there with celebrities. Did you like that whole style?
It was very interesting. I think they did it in a really funny way. I guess I think the way that we're doing it is kind of like we're actually thinking of using animations. Like it's a live action film, but we're actually thinking of supplementing with animations, like appropriate animations, where like we go into the head of the the character and we show what's going on in his mind, or we go into the computer and it's showing what's going on in the computer with animations. So it's kind of like it's an appropriate thing, and those animations, the knowledge that is transmitted there, that is used later on in the actual story. So it's like you have to understand quantum computing to actually get the story, but it's like right there for you. So it's not something that's complicated.
Yeah. Have you read a lot of books on screenwriting? Have you written whole screenplays, and what sort of writing?
I've written a good amount of screenplays. Nothing like crazy. I'm not like I like writing, but I'm not like the big writer dude. I have a co-writer on this project who's helped me write, and she is like a pretty well-established writer. So yeah, but I've written screenplays before, shorts. I've definitely written a lot. I am working kind of in the background on a feature, but right now I'm not making a lot of headway in that because I'm working on this project.
Yeah. What are you doing this summer? You got a job, or are you going to be making films?
Yeah. So I have an internship right now with a production studio near me. They're really awesome, and because I'm in the Washington D.C. area, I do a lot of things with National Geographic, Discovery Channel, all those guys. So that's probably what I'm doing, and it's like my favorite place by far on Earth. Just going there, and because a lot of those companies actually outsource their work to these production companies, so we get all like the really cool stuff. So that's probably what I'm going to be doing. I'm also looking to get some internships at like a specifically science filmmaking studio in Maryland as well.
Who's the one person you've worked with so far that you've learned the most from? Is there any one teacher, anything like that that's really taught you a lot?
Yeah, I would actually say so. I have an internship right now, and the boss is the best guy I've ever met by far. He is like literally the best person. But because of the pandemic, we haven't really been able to work on set as much. So I had an internship in 9th and 10th grade, and I think the DP there, the DP there was the one who really taught me how to act on a set and how to basically be a filmmaker. He was fresh out of college and taught me a lot. So I think he was like my first kind of mentor going into this.
Yeah. And you said you spent some time in India. With your parents are from there originally?
Yeah, my parents are from there. I was born in the U.S. and have lived in Maryland my entire life. But yeah, I've been to India multiple times. Generally love it there. It's a really different culture, like totally different. So I love kind of.
What's it like when you go there? How long have you gone there for?
I would say it's probably like month-ish at a time or so. So I'll stay there for like a month in the summer, and then come back after that. And I have relatives there, so I just stay with them. And yeah, it's a great fun time.
Yeah, and where you said in the north of India?
Yeah, north. So it's in the state of Gujarat, mostly in Ahmedabad, which is the biggest city in Gujarat. So yeah.
Huh. And what language do they speak around there?
They speak Gujarati. So I can like listen and I can understand Gujarati, but I can't speak it like super well. And I'm not very good at writing it either, but I can understand it, and that's probably what's most needed. So yeah.
You think you might make some films over there eventually?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's an amazing place, and I actually haven't been there in 3 years or so. So because first of all, the pandemic, and I think before that we usually go every other summer. So so it's been about 3 years since I've been there.
Do you think among your friends, are any of your friends really good storytellers in the films that they make and things like that? What do you see?
Not many of my friends are filmmakers. I have a few, and I wouldn't say they're the best storytellers. I think they're more on the visual side. I do have like writer friends who are very good at storytelling, and I just know some people who are just really good at telling stories, like just verbally telling stories. You can tell the difference between them and maybe someone else who's telling the story. They just tell it in this like really gripping way, which is fascinating to observe.
Like what sort of stories? Can you think of one that told you?
Like stories, like one time we were kind of walking in a neighborhood, and this is like when I was younger and had kind of like made dumb decisions, but we were ding dong ditching, when I was like, we were ding dong ditching a family or like a house, and we basically like he was right at the door, so we didn't like have time to run away, so we just like basically like, hid behind trees, and we basically had this like wild goose chase around the neighborhood because he was really mad. And when we got back, we told the rest of it was like at the party, and we told the rest of our party what happened. And this one kid was telling the story, and it was like he told it so perfectly. I was like really impressed by his ability to storytell.
We did that when I was a kid, but it seems like in today's world now with Ring cameras on people's doorsteps, and they'll film you, and then there with facial recognition, and they'll contact the police. Next thing you know, you'll go to prison for life for ringing somebody's doorbell and running away.
Yeah. It's intense, yeah.
Got another chat question. This one from Mr. DYT 436. Amogh, you mentioned that your willingness to do something different led you to make your first video. How important do you think that how important do you think is this trait, daring to be different, to reach for the stars?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes,
Nice.
I think that is so important, because if you don't do something different, you're just going on the status quo, right? The entire time. There's like literally, obviously, the normal, I guess, path for people right now is not necessarily reaching for the stars, right? The average person is not, an insane change maker. So if you don't dare to go out of that normal curve, I guess, then there is no way that you can actually become a massive reaching for the stars type of person. So I think it's really important to not only like look at things at a different way, to also just when you see something where I think like almost a natural reaction for me is when I see something that people are doing, I try to do something different. I'm not saying this is like some crazy, I'm some special person. This is a pretty common trait, I would say, among a lot of people. But I think that's really led me to my love of filmmaking. That's really led me to some very interesting places. So I think it is imperative that people have that.
Did you watch the Oscars this last Sunday?
I did. I like passively watched it. I was doing something else while watching, but I did watch it.
Had you seen a lot of the movies?
I actually had not seen a lot of them. I had seen a few of them. I saw Nomadland, so that's like, I guess, a big one. But I hadn't seen a lot of them, no.
Had your friends seen a lot of the movies?
No, oh my God, I asked them and they had no idea what any of those movies were. And in fact, my teacher was like, emailed me, she's like, did you watch the Oscars? Do you know what any of those movies are? And I was like, yeah, so I don't think movies are, like, at least Oscar-winning movies are as big in fashion as they were maybe a few years ago.
Yeah, no, in previous generations, it's clearly a system in change and pretty strange. What do you think that'll be like going to film school? I mean, if you start this fall, it'll still be kind of pandemic circumstances. How are you going to make films?
Yeah, so I'm actually planning to go to kind of like the engineering filmmaking area. So kind of inventing new communication techniques. But I'll obviously be doing films as well. And New York City is obviously going to be a interesting spot to be during the end of a pandemic, I guess, or if it ends by then.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've so far been able to make films here in where I'm in kind of the suburban area in Maryland. I'm sure in New York it'll be really different, but I'll have to actually see what it's like there to see if I can continue making films. Yeah.
All right, here, we got a few more minutes. Let's go through a few of these ABTs that you sent me. I'll let you, can you see it there on your screen?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll let you read those to us. So read us this one.
Sure. So my crew and I were making a film, and we were filming on a street, but we couldn't film because cars kept driving by. Therefore, we dressed a crew member up in a reflective construction worker suit and stopped the cars on the road, which is totally legal.
True story?
True story, yes.
That's awesome. Guerrilla filmmaking. Cool. Okay, next one.
Yeah, so I'm a high schooler and was offered admission to 2 prestigious colleges, NYU and Johns Hopkins, but could not decide between the 2 as they both cater to my future goals. Therefore, I consulted mentors, eventually making my decision with their input and my gut feeling. which is NYU.
And is it's still in process, or you have committed to?
I'm not committed, but I've basically made a decision. NYU is probably where I'm going to go.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay. All right. It's going to be fun having you there, and we could talk ABT all the time. You can bring the secret technique of ABT into your film program and pull your classmates aside and say, hey, look, here's something you could use for structuring your story. Here we go. Another one.
I was walking down the road today and was on my way to take a driver's test, but I saw a tornado forming. Therefore, I turned around, walked back home, and canceled my test. The tornado forming is not a true story, but the rest of it is.
Well, you got to have a little fiction in there. That's great. And then one more, and this is one that we'll maybe see if we want to fiddle around with a little bit. So let's see what you got here. Go for it.
Yeah. So it's important to educate the public on science, especially those who are losing trust in science. And stories are amazing tools for communicating ideas, but not many stories in mainstream culture teach science, and most people don't like learning through lectures like traditional education. Therefore, I've decided to create narrative fictional films that teach complex science ideas. That's a mouthful.
Okay, yeah. Interesting. Let's dig in on this for a minute. I got to move this window around here so I can see the whole thing. There we go. Okay. Important to educate the public on science, especially those who are losing trust. All right. So what's the problem here in this narrative? We're gonna give you 5 minutes here of the ABT build exercise that we do in the course. So we start off with, what's your problem?
My problem is that I guess there's two, which could be a problem in this ABT thing, which is not many stories in mainstream culture teach science, and most people don't like learning through lectures.
That's exactly a problem to start with. So you want to begin by whittling this down to the singular narrative. And the exercise we usually do is try and tell me the problem in just 5 words or less. So can you take a shot at that? What's the problem that you're interested in 5 words or less? And you might even not look at the screen, and just off the top of your head, what would you say in this context? What's the problem you're interested in?
Yeah, I remember the Christmas tree thing. There was an overarching problem. I think it's people don't trust science.
Okay. All right. So that interests you. Now, looking at what you've got in red there, you haven't said that in there at all, right?
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, but many stories, mainstream culture, teach science, and most don't like learning through lectures. You had something in there in the blue material. You've got losing trust in science. Okay, so here's a little tutorial lesson for you. Number 1, the blue material is, you want that to be the ordinary world. And the ordinary world, as defined in the monomyth, is a world of peace and tranquility, because what you want to do is achieve your maximum input or impact on the word but. And the way to achieve that is by laying down a calm, almost flatline opening foundation where we don't have any drama going on. We'd have no problems. The brain is kind of on idle. And then you hit us in an instant. So think in terms of a murder mystery. You've got a calm, quiet town, but then you discover a dead body. In an instant, everything fires up and everything goes into kind of alarm mode. That's the best way in a noisy world to try and get across to people and capture them in a single instant. And so what you've got here, you've mentioned this idea of people losing trust in science. So that's already kind of hitting on a problem there. And your overarching interest then is about trust in science. And so really, if that's the narrative that you want to be developing here, if that's what your core problem is that the problem is people are losing trust in science. And that's what you had said. Is that in just a few words, that's what you're interested in shaping something around? Okay. So then if that's what you're wanting, then you want to set up blue material that kind of leads us to that, in which you talk about a world in which science is really trusted. And science is a great thing. You tell us all the attributes in this perfect world of science. Science is wonderful. Science brings us this. Science can do this. And we could end up with an idyllic society where people really could enjoy their lives thanks to science, because it takes care of pandemics and all these other sorts of things. But the problem is that people are losing trust in science. And as a result of that, we're ending up with a lack of public support for the agendas that science putting forward. And also seems to be a lack of ideas on how to deal with that. Therefore, I'm headed to film school because I believe that narrative fictional films could possibly be a resource to help address that. Any of that making sense?
Yep, that totally makes sense. So it would be like science is an important tool to solve problems, and another good thing about science, but people don't have trust in science, and then therefore, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So these are the sorts of things that take a while to kind of get the instincts down. The idea of opening with this world that is devoid of drama, because everybody's got this tendency to, I want to grab people right at the first moment. And so they cut right to the chase. They start with the butt. And you can do that. But when you do that, you don't get any depth of impact. And so everything just kind of grabs people for the moment, but it doesn't have any lasting resonance. And that's really ultimately what you want to do. And that's one of the strengths of the ABT structure, is that it forces you into creating that context first and foremost. And one of the things that we run into, especially with younger folks, is before you really start to learn a lot about this stuff, it's hard to create context. And one of the things you see in the science world is that as people get more experience in science, they learn more, they begin to get a bigger, broader grasp on what context is. And eventually they're doing research projects where they have the ability to put this really microscopic little thing, this gene that they're sequencing, they can talk about it, why it's important in this bigger, broader context, if we can just figure out this one thing. But early on, what you'll find with the students that you go to school with is their tendency to be so focused down on the micro scale, just, figuratively speaking, that they really don't know the big picture. The big picture takes some time, but I think you've got a big head start in grasping the big picture, and you've already been reading these sorts of things and doing this sort of work. It just takes time, but at age 17, I'm deeply impressed with where you are already in grasping how this stuff works. And it's just a journey. I think I sent you a few of those videos of some of our folks giving presentations. And did you follow the whole one about the Dunning-Kruger curve?
Yes, that one was my favorite. In fact, I've used that, like you mentioned it in our first call, and I've used that so many times on like telling people about things. So
and tell me your thoughts on the Dunning-Kruger curve.
I think it's so accurate. Oh my God. And I think I followed it in filmmaking as well, where in the beginning I was like, kind of like, oh, this is like easy. I can totally become like a totally professional, crazy filmmaker. And then I was like, oh my God, good stories are really hard to create. And then I was like, uh-oh. So I kind of went into that like trough. I was like, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought. And then kind of went back up. So it's like almost every school that I've learned so far follows that curve. So I think it's super accurate.
Yeah. And it's something for you to keep with you as you head into film school, and knowing, I personally think that the trough is somewhat endless, that I don't think anybody ever totally masters narrative. It's a moving target as our society changes, its attention span, those sorts of things. And all you can do is just continue to study it and kind of respect how infinitely complex it is. It's a bit like when you hear really prominent neuroscientists, they talk about the brain and they say every year we learn more about how much we don't know, and we feel almost stupider year by year. 5 years ago we thought we knew a lot, and now we realize, oh my goodness, we're still just scratching the surface. I think that still goes on with them. It's kind of infinitely complex, but that's really good. Cool. Matt, we got any more questions before we wrap it up here?
Nope, I think we're all caught up.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, that is very cool. Amogh, thank you so much for joining us. You and I are going to stay in touch, and I will help you with your ABTs as you work on your films, developing them. And I'll have you come back again sometime in the not too distant future. And we'll just keep this as a conversation as you tell us how you're progressing as a filmmaker and heading towards film school, most likely at NYU.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor to be on your.
You betcha. All right, get back to work making those films, and I will check back with you soon. And on that note, thanks very much. Thanks, Matt. Thanks to everybody. That is this week's little podcast episode.